Have you ever wondered what happens when an emergency call is answered, but no one on the other end should be alive to make that call? Have you ever stopped to think if there is anything worse than absolute silence during a distress call? What if I told you there are things in this world that shouldn't be encountered, especially not by those sworn to save lives? My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've been a 911 dispatcher for 17 years. 17 years of hearing screams, pleas, and last words. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the night of March 15th. It was exactly 3:33 a.m. when the line rang. I remember the time with disturbing precision because when I answered, the digital clock in my station blinked 3 times and then went dark. Only mine. All the other monitors in the switchboard continued to function normally. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman, or something that had once been a woman. There was no panic in that voice. There was no fear, just an unnatural calm, as if each word were carefully chosen by something learning to speak. She said there was a fire at the old Thornhill Factory at 1408 Industrial Street. She said there were people trapped inside. She said we needed to send firefighters immediately. The strange thing, Thornhill Factory had been abandoned for 32 years. Ever since the accident. Ever since the day 47 workers burned to death when the emergency exits were locked from the outside. An arson attack that was never solved. But there was something in that woman's voice. Something that made my skin crawl. Something that told me that if I didn't send help, something terrible would happen. Not to her, but to all of us. I dispatched Fire Department Unit 7. 5 experienced men. Captain Marcus Webb had 23 years of service. He was a man who had entered burning buildings when others were fleeing. A man who believed only in what he could touch, see, and explain. 17 minutes after the dispatch, my radio crackled. It was Webb, but his voice didn't sound like that of a seasoned, confident man. It sounded like that of a child lost in the dark. He said they had arrived at the factory. The place was exactly as the records described. A red brick structure, 3 stories high, with broken windows like empty eye sockets. There was no smoke. There were no flames. There were no signs of fire. But the front doors were open. Webb said that was impossible because the city had welded all the entrances shut years ago. But there they were, the metal gates twisted inward, as if something had forced their way in from the inside. And there were footprints in the dust, fresh footprints, dozens of them, all barefoot, all leading away from the factory. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. What was most disturbing was that the footprints were burned into the concrete, as if whoever had made them had feet on fire. Webb and his team entered. I heard everything over the radio, every footstep echoing in the void, every heavy breath through their masks. And then I heard what they were seeing. The ground floor was intact, but covered in a thick layer of ash that shouldn't have been there after 3 decades. Fresh ash, still warm ash. One of the men, firefighter Reeves, commented that he could feel the heat through his boots. In the center of the main hall was something that made my blood run cold when Webb described it. A mark on the floor, a perfect circle burned into the concrete, and within the circle, symbols. Symbols that seemed to move when looked at directly, he said. Symbols that made your eyes ache and your head throb. And in the absolute center of the circle, there was a telephone, an old-fashioned rotary phone, a phone that was connected to absolutely nothing, just sitting there in the center of that infernal drawing. Webb leaned in close. I begged him over the radio not to touch it. I begged him, but he didn't listen, or chose not to. As he picked up the phone, every radio on the team emitted a sound that wasn't static. It wasn't interference. It was a chorus of voices whispering in unison, words in a language no living man should know. And then the phone in his hand started ringing. Webb dropped the phone, but the ringing didn't stop. It reverberated around the factory walls, louder and louder, more and more insistent, until it wasn't a phone ringing anymore. It was a scream of 47 agonized voices. That's when their flashlights began to flicker. That's when the temperature dropped so rapidly that the vapor from their breath turned to ice crystals in the air. That's when they realized they weren't alone in that place. There were figures in the shadows, figures Webb described as human silhouettes, but wrong in some fundamental way. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. and they were all watching. Just watching, not moving, not making a sound. Webb ordered an immediate retreat, but when the team turned to leave, the doors they had entered through were closed. Not just closed, welded shut again, as if they had never been opened. Firefighter Jenkins tried to use the chop saw. The blade shattered upon contact with the metal. It shattered like glass, leaving fragments that glowed with a light that shouldn't have been there. That's when the figures started moving. They didn't walk, they didn't run, they simply appeared closer. One moment they were 10 meters away. In the blink of an eye, they were 5, then 2, approaching in impossible increments, transgressing the very laws of space. Reeves screamed, not a scream of fear, a scream of pain. He said something was inside his head. Something was digging through his thoughts, pulling up memories, seeing things he'd kept buried, his worst sins, his greatest fears, and every secret being exposed to the figures around him. Then the walls began to bleed. Not water, not oil, blood. Real blood, warm and dark, seeping from every crack, from every brick, forming puddles on the ground that spread toward the firefighters. And in the blood, there were shapes. Shapes of hands reaching for each other. Shapes of faces screaming silently. 47 faces. 47 souls who died there in that cursed place. Webb ordered them upstairs. There were stairs at the back of the hall. Stairs that led to the second floor. Maybe there was another exit. Maybe there was a window through which they could escape. But when they went upstairs, when they went up those metal stairs that creaked under their feet, when they got to the second floor wasn't the second floor. It was the ground floor again. The same hall, the same circle, the same telephone. Impossible, Webb whispered. Impossible. They tried again. They climbed the stairs a second time and reached the ground floor again. A third time, ground floor. Fourth time, ground floor. The building was folding in on itself, trapping them in an endless loop of horror, and the figures kept approaching. Firefighter Chen collapsed. He started laughing, a high-pitched, hysterical laugh that echoed off the walls. He said he finally understood. He said the fire had never stopped. He said those workers had never stopped burning. He said they had been burning for 32 years somewhere between our world and something much, much worse. That's when the ground beneath his feet began to soften. It wasn't melting, it was transforming. Concrete becoming flesh, pulsing, hot flesh. Flesh covered in veins that pumped something black through them. The factory was alive, or maybe it always had been. Maybe the factory was just the body, and the fire 32 years ago was the birth of something that shouldn't exist. Reeves began to sink, his feet sinking into the flesh floor like organic quicksand. He screamed, tried to hold on to something, but everything he touched was also flesh. Walls of flesh, ceiling of flesh, a gigantic organism that had consumed the factory's structure and was now consuming them. The others tried to pull him away. Jenkins grabbed his arms, but when he pushed, Reeves's skin simply slipped, like a glove being pulled off. It slipped from muscle, from bone, leaving a red, screaming thing that no longer looked human. And then Reeves was pulled down into the factory organism, and the last thing I heard from him was a muffled scream that turned into a liquid gurgle before going completely silent. The remaining 4 ran. There was no more logic, no more trying to understand. Only the primal instinct to survive. They ran through the shape-shifting corridors around them. They ran through doors that led to impossible rooms, rooms filled with still-functioning machines, sewing fabric made from human hair, rooms with blazing furnaces where humanoid forms danced in the flames, inviting them to join in. Chen couldn't resist. He simply stopped running. He turned to one of the furnaces and began walking toward it. Webb shouted his name, but Chen didn't respond. He stepped into the furnace, and he didn't scream. He didn't struggle. He just stood there, the flames consuming him, a smile of ecstasy on his melting face. 3 men now, Webb, Jenkins, and the new guy, Parker, a 22-year-old kid in his first week on the job, a kid who was crying, praying, begging for his mother. They found a ladder, not the same ladder as before. This one was different. It led up through a hole in the ceiling that glowed with a soft, inviting light, a promise of escape, a lie They climbed, and kept climbing. The staircase was endless, step after step after step, climbing for minutes that turned into hours. Their legs burned with exhaustion, their lungs begged for air, but always one more step, always one more level. And then they realized they were going down. They hadn't turned, they hadn't changed direction, but somehow at some point up had become down, and they were descending back into the heart of the factory, to the heart of the thing the factory had become. They reached a room none of them had seen before. A basement that shouldn't exist because the factory didn't have a basement in the original plans. But there it was, a vast subterranean chamber illuminated by a phosphorescent glow emanating from the very walls. And in the center of the chamber, there was a door, a red door, red as fresh blood, a door that vibrated gently, pulsing like a heart. And behind the door, they could hear sounds of people working, hammers banging, machines running, voices singing old work songs. Webb approached the door. I screamed into the radio for him not to do that. I screamed until my voice was hoarse, but he had already made up his mind. There was a grim determination in his voice as he spoke his last words to me. He said, "I need to know what happened here. I need to know why they called us." And he opened the red door. On the other side, there was no basement. There was no factory. There was another place. A place where the sky was black and burning. A place where the floor was made of broken glass reflecting millions of screaming faces. A place where gigantic figures walked among towers of twisted flesh and metal. And in that place, working on impossible machines, they were the 47, the workers who died 32 years ago, still working, still trapped in their eternal routine. But their bodies had been reconstructed with parts that weren't human, gears instead of joints, tubes instead of veins. They had been transformed into living machines, condemned to work eternally for something. And that something Webb noticed. He turned, and as he turned, reality itself seemed to fold around him. He was enormous, so enormous that looking at him was like trying to grasp the concept of infinity, a mass of eyes and mouths and limbs that multiplied fractally, extending into dimensions the human mind was not designed to perceive. And he spoke, not with words, with feelings injected directly into the soul, feelings of hunger, eternal, insatiable hunger, hunger that had waited 32 years, hunger that would now be satisfied. Jenkins pulled Webb back. He closed the door, but it was too late. They had been seen, and now it knew where they were. It knew there were more souls to harvest, more workers to add to its infernal factory. The chamber began to crumble, not falling, being pulled inward, sucked toward the red door that now opened on its own, wider and wider, revealing that other place, that industrial hell where the machines never stop and the work never ends. Parker screamed that he saw his grandmother. He screamed that she was calling for him from the other side. He started toward the door. Webb held him back, but the boy was strong in his madness. He struggled, he bit, he scratched, and then he broke free and ran for the door. He entered the room, and instantly, things emerged from the shadows. Things metallic and organic. They grabbed Parker. They began to dismantle him, not like predators, like experienced workers dismantling a machine, with precision, with purpose, every part cataloged, every piece reused. Webb and Jenkins ran. They ran back up the stairs. They ran through the corridors that now contracted around them like a swallowing esophagus. They ran until they saw a light, real light, sunlight streaming through a broken window. Jenkins didn't hesitate. He jumped, 3 stories. He landed in a pile of rubble. He broke his leg, but he was out. He was free. Webb was about to follow him when he felt something touch his shoulder. He turned around. It was one of the figures, but this time he could see her clearly, and he recognized the face. It was Sarah Thornhill, the factory owner, the woman who had locked the doors 32 years ago, the woman who had disappeared the night of the fire. But it wasn't just Sarah. It was every possible Sarah. It was her at 20, at 40, at 60, existing simultaneously in an impossible superposition. And they all smiled. They all reached out. They all whispered the same thing. You're not here to save anyone. You're here to replace someone. 47 needs to become 48. The balance needs to be maintained. Webb did the only thing he could do, the only thing any man would do. He jumped. But when he jumped, when he was in the air, the window closed. It simply ceased to exist, and he fell into the building, into a hallway that hadn't been there before, a hallway that led back to the circle, back to the phone, and the phone was ringing. Second story, the return. Have you ever wondered if it's possible to escape something that specifically wants you? Have you ever considered that perhaps destiny is not a straight line, but a circle that always takes you back to the same point? What if I told you the factory didn't pick those men at random? 7 days had passed since that night. 7 days during which I tried to understand what had happened. Jenkins lay in a psychiatric hospital, sedated, repeating over and over, "They're still working. They never stop working." And Webb was missing. Search teams scoured the factory. They found Jenkins in the wreckage outside. They found evidence that others had been there. They found firefighter equipment. But they didn't find Webb. They didn't find Reeves, Chen, or Parker. And even more disturbing, they didn't find the burned circle. They didn't find the phone. They didn't find any red door. The factory was exactly as it should have been. Abandoned, empty, dead. But I knew the truth. I had heard it all. And then, on the 7th night, at 3:33 in the morning, my phone rang. The same voice. The same woman's voice that wasn't quite a woman's voice. But this time, she didn't ask for help. She asked a question. "You sent them to us. Why did you send them to us?" My blood froze. I tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. How do you respond to something you shouldn't be able to ask questions about? The voice continued. "You've worked in this place for 17 years. 17 years sending people into situations they can't escape. 17 years deciding who lives and who dies based on how quickly you dispatch help. You're just like us. You harvest souls too. You just didn't realize it until now." I hung up the phone, but it kept ringing. Not my station phone, my personal phone, my cell phone, my home phone, which was 20 miles away, all ringing in sync, all the same call. I answered again. I had no choice. The voice said, "3 of them we kept, but 1 we gave back. Look for Marcus Webb. He has a message for you." The call dropped. 3 hours later, Webb was found. He was standing in the middle of his lawn in front of his house, completely naked, staring at the bedroom window where his wife and daughter slept. He had been there for hours, according to neighbors, as still as a statue, unblinking, not visibly breathing. When the police approached, he didn't resist. He meekly allowed himself to be led away. But when they tried to get him into the police car, he spoke his first words addressed to the officer. "Tell the attendant that he was the first, that his voice was the first we heard, that when we first opened our eyes in that place, his was the first presence we felt through the waves, and that now we know where he is." Webb was taken to the same hospital as Jenkins, but that first night, something happened. Something the doctors can't explain. At 3:33 a.m., all the patients in the psychiatric ward woke up simultaneously, and they all began drawing. Those who could hold pencils drew on paper. Those restrained drew with their fingers in their own beds using blood that simply began to drip from their noses for no medical reason. And they all drew the same thing, the same symbol, the same circle, the same impossible symbols that danced and burned the eyes of those who saw them. Webb was among them, but he was also speaking in a language none of the doctors recognized, a language that seemed to be made of syllables the human throat was not designed to produce. They recorded what he was saying. They sent it to linguists. None of them could translate it, but one of them, an elderly professor who had studied dead languages all his life, turned pale when he heard it. He said it wasn't a human language. He said it was earlier, something that existed before humans existed, something that had been buried for good reasons. And then the fires started. Small, unexplained fires around the city, always at 3:33 a.m., always in locations connected to the victims: Reeves' house, Chen's apartment, the college dorm where Parker had lived before becoming a firefighter. But the fires didn't spread. They burned in perfect circles 2 meters in diameter, and within the circles, the same mark, the same symbols. And at each fire site, security cameras captured something. Just one frame. A single frame of video showing figures standing inside the circles. Figures investigators recognized. Reeves, Chen, Parker, but not as they were, as they had become. Bodies reconstructed with parts that glowed with their own light. Eyes that were multiple. Mouths that opened at impossible angles. They had returned, but not alone. They had brought the factory with them. Or maybe the factory had never been a physical place. Maybe it was an idea, a concept, a seed planted at the time of that first fire 32 years ago. A seed that had waited patiently, growing, feeding on terror and guilt. And now, it was ready to blossom. I started seeing the signs too. Signs that something was wrong with the reality around me. My apartment had an extra door, a door that hadn't existed when I moved in, a door that was always closed, a door through which I could hear sounds of machinery, sounds of work. I wouldn't open that door. I knew what was on the other side. But then Jenkins escaped from the hospital. He wasn't fleeing like a desperate patient. He walked out the front door, in broad daylight, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit none of the staff had seen him wearing. He walked the city streets, visiting specific addresses. My address was one of them. I found him waiting in front of my building. He looked different, straighter, more confident. There was something behind his eyes that wasn't quite human. When he spoke, it was with multiple overlapping voices. You have to understand. The fire wasn't an accident, it was a portal. Sarah Thornhill knew what she was doing when she locked those doors. She was offering a sacrifice. 47 souls to open the way, to bring something through, something that had promised her power, wealth, immortality. He smiled, a very wide smile, but the ritual was interrupted. The firefighters arrived too quickly that night. They managed to break down the doors. They saved 3 people before the building collapsed. 3 people who survived, 3 souls who were not consumed. My heart raced. I knew where this was going. The portal opened halfway. The thing on the other side was trapped between worlds, starving, waiting, and the factory became its stomach, a place where it could slowly digest the 44 souls it had managed to capture, keeping itself alive, waiting for the opportunity to complete the ritual. Jenkins took a step closer. We needed 3 more. 3 to make 47. But you sent us 5. That means we have 2 extra souls. 2 souls we can use to expand, to create new portals, new stomachs. And guess who's at the top of the list? I went back to my apartment. I locked the door. I called the police. But when I tried to explain, when I tried to make them believe me, I heard it. I heard it through the phone. That voice. That damned woman's voice. There's nowhere to run. We're already in. We always have been. And then it hit me. The extra door in my apartment. It was open. Just a crack. Just enough to see the phosphorescent glow on the other side. Just enough to see a silhouette moving toward the opening. A silhouette I recognized. It was me. Or was it me? A version of me with eyes that were multiple and bright. A version of me with a very wide smile. A version of me that had accepted the call, that had crossed over, that had become part of the factory. And she whispered in my own voice, "You can't save everyone. You never could. But you can join us. You can stop fighting. You can finally rest." The door opened completely. On the other side, I saw the factory, but no longer as Webb had described it. Now it was beautiful. The machines sang harmonious melodies. The workers danced as they performed their tasks. The black sky was dotted with stars that pulsed in sync with the beating of a gigantic, invisible heart. And in the center of it all, Webb, Reeves, Chen, and Parker. They waved at me. They smiled. They looked happy. It's not punishment, my other self said. It's purpose. It's belonging to something bigger. It's never being alone again. It's never having to make impossible decisions about who lives and who dies again. I took a step towards the door, and another, and another, and then I stopped, because I realized something crucial, something that changed everything. They couldn't force me. If they could, they would have done it already. They needed me to choose. They needed me to accept the invitation voluntarily. The ritual required consent. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, I made my decision. I left the apartment. I left everything behind. I moved to another city, I changed my name. I quit my job as a 911 dispatcher. I spent months looking over my shoulder, hoping to see figures in the shadows, but they never came. Or maybe I was just a test. Maybe they wanted to see if I was strong enough to resist. Because if the factory needs workers, it needs specific workers. Workers who choose to be there. Workers whose will was broken not by force, but by persuasion. And those who resist? Well, those who resist become something different. But here's the real horror. The real twist that no one could have suspected. They investigated my story. They investigated everything I told them. They found records. Records from the Thornhill Factory. Records from the fire 32 years ago. But they found something else. They found that one of the 911 dispatchers that night 3 decades ago, when they first made the call about the fire, had delayed dispatch. Just 5 minutes. Just long enough for the doors to become too hot to touch. Just long enough to ensure no one outside could help. That attendant had been my predecessor. The man who trained me when I started 17 years ago. The man who retired and handed me the shift. The man who told me on his last day, "Some calls are special. Some calls are for you. And when you hear one, you will know. Because they will speak directly to your soul." They found him dead 3 months ago, in his apartment, which had an extra door. A door that was open. A door through which he had finally answered his own calling. And in his pocket, they found a piece of paper, with a phone number, my personal number, and a message in ancient handwriting. Next in line. So do you understand now? The factory isn't just in one place, it's in many. It's in every place where work happens, where people sacrifice themselves, where souls are ground down by routine until nothing remains but bodies executing movements. And me, I didn't escape. Because 4 nights ago, at 3:33 in the morning, my new phone rang. Even though I'd changed my number, even though I'd moved, even though I'd buried my old identity. And when I answered, the voice on the other end was familiar. It was my predecessor's voice. He said only one thing. They don't want you as a worker. They want you as a recruiter. Like us. Like all of us who answer calls. Because every person you dispatch, every life you try to save, you're just feeding the factory. You're just sending more souls to be processed. You never worked for 911. You always worked for them. And then I understood. I understood why the voice on that first call sounded so familiar. Why it felt like I was learning to speak. It was because I was speaking my own words. Words I would say in the future. Because time doesn't work linearly in the factory. Past and future blend together. And the person who made that call, it was me. It's always been me. I was on the other side. I was already working for them. I always had been. And this version of me that's telling this story, it's just a memory. A recording. One last message I managed to send before I completely passed away. Because as you listened to this story, as you paid attention to every word, something happened. Look around. Do you realize? There is a door that wasn't there before, and she's opening up. And on the other side, I'm waiting. At 3:33 in the morning, as I always have been, as I always will be. Welcome to the factory. Your turn is about to start.